Hello everyone, Dr. Salma Shahid here from Department of Biochemistry, DC Women University, Islamabad. Our course is Human Physiology. We are going to start our first lecture today. So let me introduce you first about our first lecture. The topic to cover is hormones, first of all. We will try to cover all contents of and related to hormones. For your ease, I have distributed this topic in 3 lectures. In first lecture, we will cover general introduction of central nervous system, glands, what are hormones, what is their mechanism of regulation and mechanism of their action, what are different types of glands and how many types of hormones are present. So let's start our first slide, introduction to hormones. And coordinate your body's metabolism, your energy level, reproduction, growth, and our body's development, and even response to injuries, stress, and our mood swings. So we can say this is a system that interacts with the nervous system to coordinate and integrate body activities by means of hormones. If we talk about its functions, we can say that now there are 3 main functions of the endocrine system. Number 1, it makes hormones for development and growth. Many different vital hormones are created and controlled within the endocrine system. Number 2, it sends hormones into our bloodstream. And number 3, most important, it regulates the release of these hormones. Following are the integral parts of endocrine system. Number 1, hypothalamus, the most important part of our endocrine system. Hypothalamus is located at the base of the brain, where the optic nerves behind each eye cross and meet. This region is known as optic chiasm. The hypothalamus secretes hormones that stimulate or suppress the release of hormones in the pituitary gland. In addition, it also controls water balance, sleep, temperature, appetite, and blood pressure. The diagram shows major endocrine organs. For example, here we can see the location of a hypothalamus just situated slightly above the pituitary gland. So, next is the pineal body. The pineal body is located below the corpus callosum, in the middle of the brain. It produces the hormone melatonin, which helps the body to sleep. The next is pituitary gland. What is a pituitary gland? As we all know, there are 2 main parts of the pituitary, anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. The pituitary gland is located below the brain. This gland controls many functions of the other endocrine glands. Our pituitary gland is a small pea-sized gland located at the base of the brain, below our hypothalamus. It sits in its own little chamber under our brain. It's a part of our endocrine system and is in charge of making several essential hormones. The pituitary gland also tells other endocrine system glands to release their appropriate hormones. Here, I have a question in my mind. Do you know what is a gland? A gland is an organ that makes one or more substances, such as hormones. It helps to digest juices, sweet or tears. Endocrine glands release hormones directly into the bloodstream. And do you know what are hormones? Hormones are chemicals that coordinate different functions in our body by carrying messages through your blood to various organs, like skin, to muscles and other tissues. These signals tell our body what to do and when to do. So these chemicals are known as hormones. Okay, the next very important is a thyroid and parathyroid gland. The thyroid gland and parathyroid glands are located in front of the neck, below the larynx, as we can see in this diagram. As we can see clearly in this diagram, it is just situated in the neck below the larynx. The larynx that is known as voice box. The thyroid plays an important role in the body's metabolism, while the parathyroid glands play an important role in the regulation of the body's calcium balance. So both are shown here. In next lecture, I will let you know its mechanism in detail for both thyroid and parathyroid glands. The next is adrenal gland. As we can see here, an adrenal gland is located on top of each kidney. Here, right and left kidney. Like many glands, the adrenal glands work in collaboration with the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. The adrenal glands make and release corticosteroid hormones and epinephrine that maintain blood pressure and regulate their metabolism. Next comes another very important hormone, pancreas. Pancreas is also an organ of our body and is directly related to our digestive system. The pancreas is located on back of the abdomen, as we can see in this diagram, behind the stomach. The pancreas plays a role in digestion as well as hormone production. Hormones produced by the pancreas include insulin and glucagon. These two are main hormones secreted by pancreas as gland, which regulate levels of blood sugar. The next comes ovaries in female and testes in male. So as far as ovaries are concerned, all of us know very well that women's ovaries are located on both sides of the uterus, right and left ovary, below the opening of the fallopian tubes. What are fallopian tubes? They are tubes that extend from uterus to the ovaries. In addition to containing the egg cells necessary for reproduction, the ovaries also produce some very important hormones known as estrogen and progesterone. And we know that these two hormones are very much related to different reproductive systems such as labor pain and preparation of uterus, etc. Then comes testes in man. A man's testes are located in a pouch that hangs suspended outside the male body. The testes also produce a hormone known as testosterone and also produce sperms. The picture shows some of the major endocrine hormones and their target tissues. The diagram shows that when signal, this as you can see from this diagram, starting from central nervous system, there is situated hypothalamus behind the central nervous system. We can see that central nervous system controls directly release or action and release of hypothalamus. Central nervous system command hypothalamus to release hypothalamic hormones. They are also known as releasing factors. When a signal comes from the environment, the central nervous system responds to that signal. So, central nervous system becomes neuroendocrine region of the signal. It gives command to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the major endocrine gland and release hypothalamic hormones. These hormones act directly on the pituitary gland. That is the first target to that signal. Now, as we have already seen that there are two lobes of pituitary, anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. So, as a result, if we discuss about interior pituitary lobe secrete certain other hormones like corticotropin, thyrotropin, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, somatotropin hormone. They are also known as growth hormone and prolactin. And when hypothalamus act on posterior pituitary, it releases two important hormones, oxytocin and vasopressin. So there are total 8 hormones that are released in total by both lobes of pituitary. These hormones, these 8 hormones, in result will act on the second target glands. So they are second target glands: adrenal cortex, thyroid, and ovaries and testes. It releases the ultimate hormone, that is cortisol. For example, if we talk about adrenal cortex, interior pituitary will release corticotropin hormone. This corticotropin hormone will act on second target gland, adrenal cortex, and will command adrenal cortex to release cortisol, corticosterone, and aldosterone. This cortisol will now act on many body tissues like liver, kidney, etc. Similarly, another hormone secreted by pituitary is thyrotropin hormone. The thyrotropin will act on thyroid gland and will release thyroxine. As a result, thyroid gland will release thyroxine, T3 and T4, and it will act on its second target. In thyroid, in turn, will release thyroxine. These hormones will act on the liver and muscles. Then comes follicle stimulating hormone, the third important hormone secreted by interior pituitary gland. The follicle stimulating hormone are specialized for ovaries and testes, and they will command ovaries to release progesterone and estradiol. Similarly, luteinizing hormone also act on ovaries and testes and help to release their respective hormones, progesterone by ovaries and testosterone by testes. And as a result, these hormones, progesterone and testosterone act on ultimate targets and produce their and perform their functions. Some other hormones such as somatotropin, prolactin, oxytocin, and vasopressin of posterior pituitary act directly on their ultimate target. Their second targets are not present. There are some other hormones which are released by the endocrine system, such as insulin, glucagon, somatostatin, and epinephrine, norepinephrine. When they are related to balancing of blood glucose level. When blood glucose level is high, pancreas release insulin, which distribute excess glucose of blood towards liver and other muscles which need this glucose. For adrenal medulla, central nervous system has direct access till this gland and activate adrenal medulla to release epinephrine, which will act on liver muscles of heart. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, as we already know that they are released in case of stress and act with the help of glucagon to lower the blood glucose level. We will discuss now in detail about hormones. Hormones, they are our body's chemical messengers. They travel in our bloodstream to tissues or organs. They work slowly over time and affect many different processes, including growth and development. So they are small molecules, or in nature they are proteins produced by endocrine tissue or organ, released into the circulation and carried to other tissues, where they act through receptors to bring about changes in cellular activities. If we talk about their functions, we can say that their main functions are growth and development, metabolism, that is how our body gets energy from the foods that we eat. Another important function is sexual development and its reproduction. Similarly, hormones also control our mood swings and many other functions performed by our body. As far as their types are concerned, there are two main types of hormones with reference to their action: paracrine hormones and autocrine hormones. Paracrine hormones, they act locally by diffusing from its source to target cell in the neighborhood. Autocrine, while the other one, autocrine action. Uh, this is the action performed by some hormones that act on the same cell that produced it and does not relate to the neighboring cells or neighboring organs. Actually, autocrine signaling is a form of cell signaling in which a cell secretes a hormone or a chemical messenger. This chemical messenger may also be called an autocrine agent that binds to autocrine receptors on that same cell, leading to change the cell and does not affect its neighboring tissue or any other organ. So, what are major functions of hormones? Number one, they regulate metabolic processes. For example, thyroid hormones. Hormones also control the rate of some chemical reactions. Now, what are these chemical reactions? Like bone growth and their enlargement. Similarly, growth of hairs and nails. So, growth hormones come in this category and control this function. Role of insulin and glucagon, which are related to regulate the blood glucose level with the help of metabolic processes such as glycolysis, gluconeogenesis, similarly glycogenolysis and glycogenesis. So we can say that hormones aid in the transport of substances across the cell membrane of their target cells, and examples are here insulin and glucagon. They also regulate water and electrolyte balance. For example, we talk about here antidiuretic hormones, calcitonin and aldosterones. We will discuss in detail their function in next lecture. Hormones also play a vital role in reproduction, growth, and development. For example, estrogen, progesterone released by ovaries, and testosterone released by testes, such as embryo formation. They control embryo formation, uterus preparation during pregnancy, lactation, and labor pains. Hormones also control secondary sexual characteristics. The next we will discuss about hormone release is regulated by neuronal and hormonal signal. So the question is how hormones are regulated. As we have already seen in our last slides that central nervous system is the control center of all activities performed by the body. Actually, hypothalamus is the main gland who assess and analyze the environmental signal and decides which hormones to be released and should be acted on which target tissue. Similarly, it also decides when this action to be stopped. This is the pathway. These steps actually, they are pathway as we have already seen in last slide how central nervous system acts towards hormones. Central nervous system receive messages and command hypothalamus to produce respective regulatory or appropriate regulatory hormones. These hormones in turn goes to pituitary gland, interior or posterior lobe of pituitary, whichever is appropriate, and command it to release hormones, appropriate hormones to act on second targets, and the process goes on as we have already seen in our last slide. As with respect to the stimulus, there are three types of humoral stimulus, hormonal stimulus, and neural stimulus. There are three types of stimuli. What is humoral stimulus? It is derived from the term humor. It means body fluids such as blood, for example. A humoral stimulus refers to the control of hormone release in response to changes in extracellular fluids. such as blood or the iron concentration in the blood. For example, a rise in the blood glucose level triggers the pancreatic release of insulin. As we know that insulin controls the blood glucose level. So as far as blood glucose level rises, automatically pancreas is triggered and stimulated to release insulin. Insulin causes blood glucose level to drop down, which and sends this extra glucose to other organs and muscles which need this glucose, and ultimately blood glucose level drop down. This signals the pancreas to stop producing insulin in a negative feedback loop. The second one is hormonal stimuli. So what is hormonal stimuli? It refers to the release of hormone in presence of another hormone. A number of endocrine glands release hormones which, when are stimulated by other hormones released by other endocrine glands. For example, we need an example here, I know. The hypothalamus produces hormones that stimulate interior portion of pituitary gland. So pituitary gland itself a hormone. The itself a gland. The interior pituitary in turn release hormones that regulate hormones production by other endocrine glands, such as we have seen in our picture here, that interior pituitary will release corticotropin. So corticotropin is an hormone released by a gland, and it will act on another gland, adrenal cortex, which is also a gland, and will release, and adrenal cortex as a result will release cortisol, and the cortisol now it will act on its ultimate target. Similarly, anterior pituitary will release thyrotropin, and thyrotropin hormone will act on another gland like thyroid gland, and will make it release thyroxine, its respective hormone, and thyroxine will act on different appropriate muscles. So this is an example of hormonal stimuli. Adrenal, such as adrenal medulla. Adrenal medulla is directly controlled by central nervous system. Adrenal medulla does not need any other gland like pituitary gland to act upon and to release its respective hormone. So adrenal medulla is directly controlled by central nervous system. Similarly, when we talk about neural stimuli, posterior pituitary comes in our mind as an example. Posterior pituitary is directly attacked by central nervous system through neural nerves. We will discuss this mechanism in detail at the end of this lecture, hopefully. Okay. This diagram shows how hypothalamus is linked to pituitary gland and controls its hormonal secretions. How does the hypothalamus, now the question here arises, how does the hypothalamus and pituitary gland interact with each other? Together, our pituitary gland and hypothalamus, both, they form a hypothalamus pituitary complex that serves as our brain's central command. This complex to control different and vital bodily functions. Our hypothalamus is actually a part of our brain that's in charge of some of our body's basic operations. This hypothalamus sends messages to autonomic nervous system and controls things like blood pressure, like heart rate and breathing. Our hypothalamus also tells pituitary gland to produce and release hormones that affect other areas of the body. So pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus through a stalk of blood vessels and nerves that they are known as pituitary stalk. Through that stalk, their hypothalamus communicates with the interior pituitary, as we can see in this diagram. Here we can see that pituitary gland is connected, the interior, especially interior and posterior, both lobes of pituitary, they are connected to hypothalamus through a stalk of blood vessels. And nerves, through that stalk, hypothalamus communicates with the interior pituitary lobe via hormones, and the posterior pituitary through nerve impulses. Hypothalamus also creates oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone and tells our posterior pituitary when to store and release these hormones. The signals from the connective neurons stimulate the hypothalamus to release hypothalamic factor into the arterial blood. The blood carry these factors directly to the capillary network of the anterior pituitary lobe. In response to these factors, pituitary gland releases its respective hormones in the blood vessels and enters in the general circulation. While on the other hand, I have already told you that posterior lobe of pituitary gland is linked to hypothalamus through nerves, impulses, nerve impulses. Therefore, we can see in the diagram that axons are arriving in the posterior lobe and stimulate this posterior lobe to release its respective hormones. Hypothalamus makes the following hormones to communicate and stimulate your pituitary gland. The point to be noted here is that these hormones are just to communicate between hypothalamus and between pituitary gland. They are not acted upon other body organs and systems. They are corticotropic tropin releasing hormone, dopamine, gonadotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, somatostatin, and thyrotropin releasing hormone. Since our pituitary gland and hypothalamus, they work together so closely. So if one of them becomes damaged, it can affect the hormonal function of the other also. How does the pituitary gland affect other organs and glands? The hormones our pituitary gland releases have effects on many parts of our body, especially our thyroid, reproductive system organs, and adrenal gland. Next comes neural stimuli, the third type of stimulus. In some cases, the nervous system directly stimulates endocrine glands to release hormones, which is referred to as neural stimuli. Recall that in a short-term stress response, the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine are important for providing the bursts of energy required for the body to respond.
Okay, now we will discuss how hormones function. This slide shows mechanism of hormone action. So the stepwise plan is here. We have already seen that different endocrine glands synthesize their appropriate hormones, such as pituitary gland releases 8 hormones in total. Similarly, thyroid gland releases thyroxine, pancreas releases insulin and glucagon, etc. These hormones then diffuse into the capillaries of general blood circulation and are then transported by blood towards muscles and other organs where they are needed. That is, we can say that they are transported towards their target cells. These hormones directly affect the target tissues. Let's try to understand this mechanism in another way by keeping in view the types and nature of hormones. We have already seen that the definition of hormone. A hormone is a tiny chemical messenger traveling along with the bloodstream. It exists to maintain internal balance, or in other words, we can say that hormones keeps the human body in a state of homeostasis. We know that hormones help in a number of functions occurring in our body. This is an extremely simple definition of hormones, as in reality, there are numerous hormones that perform an immense number of functions for various purposes. At a time, one hormone is capable to perform many functions at the same time in different organs. So, um, starting with the receptors, there are specific receptors responsible to function with specific hormone. Their sensitivity and responsiveness are dependent on both. That is, number one, the number of receptors, and number two, affinity of receptor to work with a specific hormone. We can say that the site of receptor might be, so there are different options different options relating to site of receptors. They might be present in or on the surface of the cell membrane. For example, if we talk about protein or peptide hormones and catecholamines, they are their receptors specific to these peptide hormones, they are present on the cell surface. Similarly, there are some receptors which are present inside the cytoplasm in the cell. For example, for steroid hormones, receptors are present inside the cytoplasm. And similarly, there are some hormones whose specific receptors are present in the cell nucleus. So, hormones can be divided into groups on the basis of their chemical nature. We have already seen in previous lectures that there are some hormones whose chemical nature is related to proteins, so we call them peptide hormones, or they contain polypeptide chains. So they are basically peptide or protein hormones. There are some hormones whose nature is very similar to steroids, so we can say there are some steroid hormones. Similarly, there are thyroid hormone containing iodothioneins, and there are some hormones whose chemical nature is very much similar to amino acid derivatives. So they are called amino acid derivatives. The hormones that interact with membrane bound receptors generally do not enter target cell, rather generate second messenger. Second messenger, an example for second messenger is cyclic AMP that proceed to regulate cellular metabolism. On the other hand, hormones which interact with intracellular receptors mostly regulate gene expression or chromosome function by the interaction of hormone receptor complex with the genome. In next slide, we will study in detail this mechanism of hormone receptor complex. The sum total of all the biochemical reactions result in physiological and developmental effects. Similarly, I have already told you that there are some hormones which act through the receptors which are present on the cell surface. So these hormones make a hormone receptor complex and enter the cell using this complex. That is, they enter the cell with the help of specific receptors. They enter then into the nucleus or remain in the cytoplasm, whatever the case is required. First of all, it's important to know what is a receptor. A receptor is a molecule that receives signals, which might be chemical or hormonal signal, from the environment, that is from outside the cell, and is usually located on the cell surface. It means that receptors are, we can say that receptors are proteins that undergo a conformational change upon attachment of their corresponding signaling molecule. That is, when signaling molecule attach on their specific receptor, the receptor undergoes some conformational changes, which in turn induces a chain reaction. This chain reaction, we can say this chain reaction as signal transduction. So this chain reaction occur within the cell, which leads to various cellular responses. It might include cell death also. What is a ligand? Ligand is a signaling molecule that binds to the receptor, and it can be a peptide, it can be a hormone, a neurotransmitter, it can be a drug or a toxin. Each receptor possesses two functional domains: the recognition domain, which binds ligand and the coupling domain. The second one is coupling domain, which is involved in signal transduction. If we talk about types of receptors, there are four types of receptors: cell surface receptors, similarly nuclear receptors. There are some enzyme linked receptors. Some of them are G protein coupled receptors. There are also some receptors known as ligand gated ion channels. But most of the times, two pathways are important in case of receptors. Number one, cell surface and nuclear receptor. Cell surface receptors are transmembrane proteins embedded into the plasma membrane, which play an essential role in the cell surface. Cell surface receptors, they are transmembrane protein embedded into the plasma membrane, which play an essential role in maintaining communication between the internal processes within the cell and various types of extracellular signals. Such extracellular signals includes hormones, cytokines, growth hormones, neurotransmitters, similarly lipophilic signaling molecules such as prostaglandins, etc., and cell recognition molecules similarly. When any of these ligands bind to their corresponding receptor, a conformational change is triggered, which initiates an intracellular signaling pathway. Note that each ligand has its own specific cell surface receptor. How cell surface receptor work? This slide shows a detailed diagrammatic description. Cell surface receptors, they are membrane anchored proteins. We can say that they are membrane bound proteins that bind to the ligand on the outside surface of the cell. In this type of signaling, the ligand does not need to cross the plasma membrane. So many different kinds of molecules, including large hydrophilic or water loving, may act as ligands. When hormone is released from their respective endocrine gland, they bind with the specific receptors present on the cell surface. They bind to the specific receptor present on the cell surface. As a result, make a cell surface receptor complex. So we can call it a ligand receptor complex, which triggers intracellular response. This type of hormones just enter the plasma membrane and catalyze the formation of second messenger, that is cyclic AMP, as we can see in this diagram, that a self-surface receptor complex binds an incoming hormone. This hormone is generated as a result of environmental signal. So this hormone does not directly enter into the cell, but it sends message and generates second messenger, which is, for example, cyclic AMP. This cyclic AMP acts as second messenger, and second messenger molecule then initiate required reaction by changing the activity of already present specific enzyme. So it make a change. It alter activity of pre-existing enzyme, and this second messenger is also responsible to change the activity of specific gene present inside the nucleus. Okay. At target cell, the protein hormone binds with the specific receptor embedded in the cell membrane of target cell. This binding activates a series of chemical reaction in the cytoplasm of target cell. The product of these reactions is a substance known as second messenger, as we have already seen in this diagram. The second one is nuclear receptor hormone. In case of nuclear receptor hormone directly, for example, there are some steroid or thyroid hormone which act through nuclear receptor hormones and in this case hormone enters directly into the cell, and crossing from cytoplasm and nuclear membrane, it enters into the nucleus, and then inside the nucleus it combines with its specific receptor and make a nucleus receptor, a hormone receptor complex. It cause alteration in the specific in the properties of specific genes. It means it create altered transcription of specific gene. This alteration then alter amount of newly synthesized proteins and make new proteins which act on their target cells. It is a diagrammatic description of general mechanism of cell receptor hormones. Most of the peptide hormones like catecholamines, glucagon, corticotropin, tropic releasing hormones, or thyroxine, parathyroid, follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormones act through this general mechanism. When a signal comes at the surface, um, at the cell target cell, and respective hormones are released from its appropriate gland, it binds with the cell surface receptor. This binding activates nearby enzyme such as adenyl cyclase. Adenyl cyclase then activate cyclic AMP or other secondary messenger. Receptor of all these hormones are protein coupled receptors. The binding with the receptor triggers a number of biochemical processes inside the cell. And also changes will occur in the receptors. As a result, a number of enzymes will be activated that will cause the formation of cyclic AMP through adenyl cyclase. The cyclic AMP will activate next cascade of enzyme activation. As a result, cellular response will be initiated. There are depending upon types of mechanism of hormone, we can say that there are basically two types of receptor mechanism. Number one, fixed membrane receptor mechanism, and number two, mobile receptor mechanism. What is fixed membrane receptor mechanism? This type of mechanism is shown by the water, so most of the time by water soluble hormones that are amines or proteins in composition, such as growth hormones, oxytocin, ADH, etc. While mobile receptor mechanism is shown by lipid soluble hormones, such as fatty acids and steroid hormones, that can easily pass through the plasma membrane. Now, for fixed membrane receptor mechanism, for these hormones can't pass through the lipid membrane. They have their target receptor on the cell membrane to which the hormone bind. When the hormone binds on the surface target receptor, as we have already seen in last slide, the enzyme adenyl cyclase in the cell membrane is activated. This helps in the production of cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP acts as the secondary messenger. It diffuses through the cell membrane and activates several enzymatic reactions to cause biochemical changes. The target cell responds to these changes and cyclic AMP is deactivated by the enzyme phosphodiesterase. While for mobile receptor mechanism, they possess intracellular receptors. The hormones bind to the target receptor that activates the enzymatic activity of the cell to bring about biochemical changes. Transcription of DNA is initiated by the hormone receptor complex. The messenger RNA is translated into protein, and this protein causes biochemical changes inside the cell. Hormones, there is another very important function of hormones. Hormones also act as regulators. They help maintaining the internal environment of the body. When the secretion of hormones is under the control of other hormones, it is known as feedback control. It can be of two types: positive feedback control and negative feedback control. The end product of action, what is positive feedback control? In case of positive feedback control, when the end product of action when end product of action cause more of the action to occur in a feedback loop. For example, for blood clotting or like menstrual cycle, etc. While in case of negative feedback control, in this type of regulation, the end product of a process reduces the stimulus of that same process. For example, we can say for temperature regulation or regulation of blood sugar. Similarly, hormones may also act as messenger. The neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus secrete such hormones which are known as neurohormones into the blood. These neurohormones are carried to the pituitary gland and stimulate this gland to release various other hormones which act on other glands to release their appropriate hormones. Hence, they are known as also known as releasing factor. This is another name given to the neurohormones.